Oh, I said no about 4 times. I mean, it terrified me. There was no muscle in my body that told me I should play myself in a movie.
In 2007, Nicolas Cage outbid Leonardo DiCaprio for a dinosaur skull. He owned 2 castles, a private island, and a $150,000 pet octopus. Then the unthinkable happened. His net worth fell from $150 million to nothing. Pushing himself to his limit, he appeared in 29 straight-to-video films just to keep creditors away.
Look into my eyes.
And now, at 61, after years of silence, Cage is finally revealing the truth behind his downfall.
I was drinking champagne at 9 years old with my father and eating Kentucky Fried Chicken. So that would be the first time I ate my favorite dish.
Long before Nicolas Cage became a symbol of excess and collapse, the warning signs were already there, scattered across the choices he made when he believed his success was permanent. His downfall began quietly, with a trust he placed in the wrong person. Cage later admitted that he handed over nearly every financial decision to a business manager he believed was protecting him. Instead, debts multiplied behind his back, properties were financed recklessly, and taxes were ignored until the numbers became life-ruining. "I didn't know how bad it was," he said years later. "By the time I understood, everything was already burning." His properties, once symbols of security, turned into traps. Homes he thought were safe investments collapsed in value overnight. Maintenance costs ballooned, loans mounted. Cage suddenly found himself juggling mortgages on castles, mansions, and land he barely had time to visit. And as his finances crumbled, so did his reputation. Reports mocked him, calling him irresponsible, out of control, reckless. People laughed at his spending without ever seeing the panic behind it. He tried to keep working, tried to stay ahead of the storm, but it was impossible. "I felt like I was disappearing, like I was losing pieces of my life faster than I could hold on to them," he would later confess. Before anyone asked about his childhood, before fame gave him a name, Cage had already lived through a private collapse that nearly erased him.
I said I can't do that, but I do recall that when I was 12, I could hold my breath for 2 minutes.
There you go.
When I was 12.
There you go.
And only after the world saw him fall did his story circle back to where it truly began. Nicolas Cage was born Nicholas Kim Coppola on January 7, 1964, in Long Beach, California, into a family that looked powerful, creative, and untouchable from the outside. His father, August Floyd Coppola, was a respected professor of comparative literature. His mother, Joy Vogelsang, was a dancer and choreographer with German and Polish roots. On his father's side, the lineage was entirely Italian and deeply embedded in Hollywood. His grandfather was composer Carmine Coppola. His grandmother was actress Italia Pennino. His uncle was Francis Ford Coppola. His aunt was Talia Shire. His cousins included Sofia Coppola, Roman Coppola, and Jason Schwartzman. By name alone, Nicolas Cage appeared to be born into certainty, privilege, and creative safety. But the reality inside his home was unstable and frightening. His mother suffered from schizophrenia and severe depression, and her illness controlled the rhythm of the household. She would disappear into long stretches where she could not remember her own life, her family, or her child. When Cage was only 6 years old, she began being institutionalized. Hospitals became part of his childhood vocabulary. By the time he was 12, his parents' marriage collapsed under the weight of her condition. She vanished for years at a time into psychiatric facilities, undergoing electroshock therapy that further erased parts of her identity. There was no warning, no explanation, and no sense of permanence. She would simply be gone.
He told us his mother, Joy, a choreographer, suffered from severe mental illness and was institutionalized for much of his childhood.
As a child, Cage learned that showing emotion did not make things better. When he reacted with fear or sadness, nothing changed. The house was still unstable. There was no comfort to fall back on and no predictable routine to hold on to. So he stopped reacting. Instead, he watched closely. He later said he studied his mother's episodes the way someone studies a school subject, paying attention to patterns, changes, and warning signs. Detaching was not a choice. It was how he survived the constant fear that she would vanish again and not come back. The silence after his mother was taken to the hospital was the kind that could pull a child apart from the inside. Nicolas Cage grew up in Long Beach with his father, trying to rebuild a life around the empty space her illness created. In that environment, Cage developed habits that were less like childhood and more like survival. He watched everything. He listened for every shift in tone, every small change in mood. He never let his guard down. Years later, Cage would describe children of schizophrenic parents as super frenetics. He said they become hypervigilant, high-strung, and constantly driven because they are always waiting for something to go wrong. He recognized those traits in himself early. He pushed too hard, moved too fast, and tried to excel at anything he touched, not because he wanted praise, but because staying still felt unsafe.
I was saying to myself, literally, I'm never going to win the Academy Award, so let's just do this anyway, because nobody wanted to make it.
In interviews, he mentioned Charlie Chaplin as another child shaped by a parent's breakdown. It comforted him to know he was not the only one who grew up learning to read people the way others read books. As Cage got older, his emotional detachment turned into something he could use. He studied human behavior with the same attention he once used to track his mother's episodes. Acting became a place where all that pressure could go.
No! We're talking tits here! Big tits! Round tits!
Cinema gave him structure. It gave him rules. It gave him a world where chaos made sense, because every scene had a purpose, and every moment led somewhere. He could express feelings on camera that he never dared show at home.
You can't do this, you know what he's like. I'm telling you, for nothing, he will kill you!
That wiring, built from fear and survival, pushed him toward Hollywood long before he was ready. But when he finally stepped into the industry, it greeted him with mockery. At the age of 15, Nicholas landed a tiny role in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, playing one of Brad's nameless friends in a burger joint. He walked onto that set with hope in his chest, credited proudly as Nicolas Coppola.
The 17-year-old blends into the background, but his Coppola name did not.
He believes his family name might finally open a door instead of closing one. Instead, it became a target. The moment he arrived, people looked at the call sheet, saw Nicolas Coppola, and immediately assumed he had only gotten the job because of his uncle, Francis Ford Coppola, who had directed Apocalypse Now. Instead of treating him like a young actor trying to learn, they treated him like a spoiled insider. Crew members started shouting famous lines from Apocalypse Now across the set, not because they loved the movie, but because they wanted him to feel the weight of his last name. They mimicked scenes, repeated quotes, and nudged each other as they watched his reaction. Cage tried to play along, but he was 15, the only real teenager surrounded by adults who saw him as a joke.
Why don't you get out of here? You make me get out of here.
Child labor laws cut his hours, but the mockery cut deeper. Every time someone shouted another quote across the set, he felt his stomach fold. "I just wanted to act," he would say years later, "but I felt like I didn't even belong in the building." When the director trimmed most of his scenes, it felt like confirmation that the door he had hoped for was already closing. One afternoon he looked in the mirror and realized the name Coppola no longer felt like his. It felt like an anchor around his neck. So he did something drastic. He changed it to Nicolas Cage, half inspired by Luke Cage, the comic book hero who stood alone, and half by John Cage, the avant-garde composer who broke rules without apology. It was his first real act of rebellion, and it shook the industry.
When people think of Nicolas Cage, I wanted it to have like a punk rock energy at that time.
Producers whispered that he was ungrateful and arrogant for distancing himself from the Coppola legacy. Francis Ford Coppola was hurt and angry, and he stopped offering Cage auditions or opportunities. Casting agents, unsure if hiring him would offend the Coppola family, quietly pushed him aside and refused to see him. But Cage refused to back down. He straightened his posture, lowered his voice, and decided he would rebuild himself from nothing if he had to.
I wanted it to be unpredictable. You don't know what you're going to get. I wanted it to be exciting and a little scary.
But things only continued to get worse from there. By 17, Nicolas Cage felt trapped. He had spent years trying to balance school with the chaos at home and the pressure of carrying the Coppola name. But none of it felt right. His school offered him no comfort, no direction, and no sense that anything in his life would change. He was tired of pretending he fit into a routine that never matched who he was becoming. What he wanted were movies. What he needed was a way out. So he dropped out, not with a plan, but with a clear feeling that staying would crush him faster than leaving.
Sometimes I made the deals so convoluted, it was hard for me to work out if they were on the level.
His first reality check came quickly. Most of his scenes in Fast Times at Ridgemont High were cut. The small glimmer of hope he had carried onto that set was gone, and he had nothing to fall back on except minimum wage work. He took a job at the Fairfax Cinema, selling tickets and popcorn to people who had no idea that the kid behind the counter was trying to climb into the world they were paying to watch. Between shifts, he stood in the back of the dark theater and stared at the glowing screen. He asked himself the same question over and over. How do I get from here to there? There were no answers. There was only longing. To survive, he also delivered pizzas, memorizing street names and doorways while wondering if this was all his life would ever be. His break came in the most unglamorous way possible. He was brought in to read lines, not for himself, but to help other actors audition for Rumblefish, directed by his uncle. No one handed him anything. No one cleared a path because of his name. He earned a small role on merit alone, a tiny victory that mattered more to him than anyone realized. His true breakthrough arrived with Valley Girl. It was a tiny film with a budget of about $350,000 shot in only 22 days. No one expected anything from it, but it earned more than $17 million, and suddenly people began paying attention to him. He played Randy, a punk rocker in a Romeo and Juliet-style romance, and he threw himself into it completely. He shaved his chest hair into a V.
Randy, why didn't you call me first?
Well, you know, it slipped my mind. I really didn't think it was that important, but I will tell you what I'm gonna do.
He screamed until the veins in his neck bulged. He gave the role everything he had, not for a paycheck, but for a chance. The director earned only $5,000 for the entire film. Cage did not walk away with real money either, but he did walk away with something far more valuable, a career that had finally begun. After Valley Girl, Nicolas Cage felt the first real momentum of his career, and he became determined to prove that he belonged in Hollywood for reasons that had nothing to do with his last name. When he joined Rumblefish, he treated even his supporting role as a test. He changed his entire look. He developed a distinct voice and new mannerisms. Nothing about his performance was casual. Every movement, every expression, every line was shaped with intention. He wanted people to see effort, commitment, and hunger. He wanted them to understand he was not coasting on the Coppola legacy. But the next disappointment struck hard. When The Outsiders was being cast, Cage desperately wanted the role of Dallas Winston. Dallas was the tough, fearless rebel of the story, the kind of character who carried pain like armor, and Cage felt he understood that kind of hurt better than anyone. To prepare, he locked himself in a room for 2 weeks, staring at a photo of Charles Bronson, the famous action star known for his cold, unshakable toughness. Cage studied Bronson's expression, posture, and silence, trying to reshape himself into someone harder, quieter, and more dangerous.
Punk, and I could see all the wrong he'd ever done, and I turned it all against him.
The penance stare.
He wanted to erase the sensitive teenager people mocked on Fast Times and replace him with a man who could command a room. But Francis Ford Coppola cast Matt Dillon instead. Dillon was already a rising star, the industry favorite. The rejection hollowed him out. It was losing a chance to prove himself to the one person whose approval he had been chasing since childhood. The pain ran so deep that he did something few people know. He showed up anyway. He slipped into the background of a fight scene as an uncredited extra. No name, no lines, no acknowledgement. He just wanted to be close to the movie he had wanted with everything in him. The pattern continued. When The Godfather Part 3 was cast, Cage hoped for another chance. Instead, the role went to Andy Garcia. Cage would later say that wound never fully healed. It was one thing to be rejected by the industry. It was another to be rejected by family. Then came The Cotton Club in 1984. The film was drowning in chaos. The budget exploded to $58 million. More than 30 script drafts were written, including 5 in a frantic 48-hour stretch. But the real storm hit off screen. Producer Roy Radin was murdered, shot in the head and blown up with dynamite. The disaster had been ordered by Karen Greenberger, terrified of losing her financial cut. The case became known as the Cotton Club murder trial, and Cage, only 20 years old, found himself surrounded by the darkest corners of Hollywood's underbelly. With rejection from family and violence swirling around him, Cage began pushing his body and mind to extremes. By his early, Nicolas Cage had stopped waiting for Hollywood to give him permission to be great. He began forcing himself into roles with a level of devotion that frightened even the people who worked with him. The pain he carried from childhood, from rejection,
Why'd you make the deal?
I was a kid.
What'd you get in return?
Heartache.
from never feeling chosen, turned into fuel. He believed that if he could suffer honestly, the performance would be honest too. That belief nearly destroyed him on Birdie in 1984. Cage played a wounded Vietnam veteran, a man broken in both body and mind. To feel that pain, Cage pulled out 2 of his own baby teeth without anesthetic. There was no medical need. There was only his conviction that real agony would show on film in a way nothing else could. In Birdie, his character returned from Vietnam with severe injuries, including his jaw wired shut and his head tightly bandaged. Cage wanted to feel that confinement for real. So after filming began, he wrapped his own head in bandages and refused to take them off for 5 straight weeks. He slept in them. He ate with them. He walked the streets with his vision narrowed and his skin unable to breathe, forcing himself to live inside the same trapped, claustrophobic world the character lived in. When he finally removed the bandages, his skin was wrecked with acne, irritation, and painful ingrown hairs. But the camera saw the truth he had chased, the truth he had bled for. And then, something happened that Cage never forgot. Birdie won the Grand Jury Prize at Cannes. He was still young, still raw, still unsure if Hollywood would ever take him seriously. But when he heard that win announced, it hit him with a force he didn't expect. For the first time in his career, he felt the world say, "We see you." All the pain, the bandages, the teeth, the doubt, it suddenly felt like it had meaning. It was a moment of real joy, the kind he rarely allowed himself to feel, and it told him that the suffering he poured into the work could lead somewhere real. He pushed himself again in Racing with the Moon, a World War II coming-of-age story. Cage played Nicky, a wild jock with charm and volatility.
Before I started drinking, I could not do that.
Why would you want to do that?
It gives me pleasure.
In one scene, overwhelmed by emotion, Cage cut himself with a knife just to summon the rawness he thought the moment needed. The crew froze. He bled, and Cage insisted they keep going. Every time someone told him he didn't need to go that far, he felt a familiar anger rise. The same anger he felt when people said he got roles because of his name, not because of his skill. Then came The Boy in Blue in 1986. Cage transformed his body completely, gaining 30 pounds of muscle and training relentlessly to row like a real 19th century athlete. He pushed himself until his hands blistered and his muscles locked. The film bombed anyway, but Cage earned a Genie Award nomination, proof that even when audiences looked away, the industry saw his commitment. By the middle of the decade, his fearlessness had turned into something dangerous. His passion collided with excess, and his need to prove himself began to consume him. Audiences were divided. Directors were stunned. And Cage, already bruised in ways no one could see, kept digging deeper. As Nicolas Cage's reputation grew, so did the risks he took. On Peggy Sue Got Married, he made a creative choice that nearly blew up the entire production. He invented a high nasal voice inspired by Pokey from Gumby and added large fake teeth, completely changing how the character sounded and looked.
Well, there's so many different experiences that I've had when I was really starting out and I was interested in silent film.
Kathleen Turner, who was carrying the film as the lead, was horrified. She felt his performance made scenes impossible to play honestly, and she begged Francis Ford Coppola to stop him. The crew whispered about it. The producers were angry, but Francis, trying to protect Cage's artistic freedom, allowed it. The result was chaos. Scenes had to be reshot. The tone of the film became uneven. Turner felt disrespected. The studio complained. Francis later admitted that approving Cage's choice had been a mistake, one that he should have corrected early. The tension grew so intense that it permanently changed the relationship between uncle and nephew. Cage had wanted to show he was bold and original, but instead he created frustration, resentment, and confusion on set. Then came the film that pushed him to the edge of sanity, Vampire's Kiss, 1988. Cage played a delusional literary agent spiraling out of control, and he believed the audience needed to feel the character's madness in a way that could not be faked.
When I did Vampire's Kiss, I really wanted to experiment with that.
Am I getting through to you? Alpha!
In the most shocking moment of his early career, he swallowed 3 live cockroaches. The director did not stop him. In fact, he asked for a second take, as if testing whether Cage's commitment had limits. It didn't. Years later, Cage admitted in 2023 that he regretted doing it because it was cruel, unnecessary, and far beyond anything he ever wanted to put another living creature through. At the time, he saw it as pure dedication. The film marked the start of what he later called his nouveau shamanic acting.
What I would do is I'd put on Afro-Caribbean paint, like a white and black paint, and black out my eyes so I look like this sort of Afro-Caribbean voodoo icon.
A method built on throwing himself into roles with no protection, no filter, and no fear of going too far. But even in this storm of extremes, he had moments that lifted him. Moonstruck, 1987, gave him a rare chance to show tenderness. He played a one-handed baker whose heart and longing felt painfully real on screen.
And I bake bread, and I sweat and shovel this stinking dough in and out of this hot hole in the wall.
His "snap out of it" line became iconic, and when the film won 3 Oscars, Cage felt a brief flash of joy. For once, he was being recognized not for pushing himself into madness, but for connecting with audiences in a simple human way. The extremes returned quickly. In Firebirds, 1990, he trained with real Apache helicopter pilots, pushing through intense aerial scenes, only for critics to dismiss the film as a weak attempt to copy Top Gun. Then came Wild at Heart, 1990. He wore his own snakeskin jacket, telling people it symbolized his belief in personal freedom. The film won the Palme d'Or at Cannes.
The main prize of the festival, the Palme d'Or, and the winner is...
Wild at Heart.
But the violence and chaos drove hundreds of people out of early screenings. Cage barely noticed. He was drawn to the heat of that world. He embraced it without hesitation. Even Time to Kill, 1989, an Italian-French war drama filmed in Zimbabwe, showed how far he would go for roles that most actors avoided. Difficult, lonely, and emotionally draining work that fewer people saw, but he poured himself into anyway. As Cage's star rose, the same intensity that powered his performances began to spill into his real life. The line between his characters and who he was outside of them started to blur. And without realizing it, he was walking straight into the addictions, obsessions, and collapses that would soon bring him to his breaking point. As Nicolas Cage's fame grew, the cracks in his personal life deepened. Honeymoon in Vegas revealed more than audiences realized. His character was a compulsive gambler, and Cage was slipping into the same addiction off-camera. He spent long nights at casinos, losing more than money. He was losing control. That habit would return years later, feeding into the financial wreckage waiting for him. Then came the role that would change his life forever, Leaving Las Vegas, 1995. Cage played a man drinking himself to death, and he attacked the role with terrifying honesty. He drank real alcohol during scenes, stumbling and slurring with a pain that was no longer just acting. He attended AA meetings to study the way addiction steals pieces of a person until almost nothing is left. The performance earned him the Academy Award for Best Actor.
Here are the nominees for Best Actor in a Leading Role. Nicolas Cage in Leaving Las Vegas.
But the victory came with a hidden cost. His marriage to Patricia Arquette collapsed under the emotional weight of the role. The movie gave Cage the highest honor of his career while tearing away one of the few stable parts of his life. Immediately afterward, Hollywood turned him into an action hero. The Rock, Con Air, and Face Off exploded at the box office, making Cage a global star. But the physical toll was brutal. He sprinted through chemical gas sets that temporarily damaged his vision, performed stunts that left his muscles torn, and pushed himself through exhaustion because he believed audiences deserved everything he had. During Con Air, tragedy struck when stuntman Philip Swartz was killed in an accident. Cage carried that memory with him, another weight added to a life already filled with pain. Then came National Treasure, and with it a $20 million payday. The film ignited his obsession with real treasure. He bought exotic items, rare artifacts, and historical oddities. After National Treasure, Nicolas Cage's fascination with rare objects grew into something uncontrollable. In 2007, he paid $276,000 for a dinosaur skull, outbidding Leonardo DiCaprio without realizing it had been stolen from Mongolia. He bought the haunted Lalaurie Mansion in New Orleans, a property infamous for torture and death. He collected castles, cars, and artifacts the way other people collected souvenirs. Each purchase felt exciting in the moment, but everyone pushed him closer to danger. Then came Ghost Rider. On paper, it was everything he had ever fought for. a major studio film, and a global box office hit. But behind the scenes, the success was tearing him apart. The long hours under heavy gear, the constant heat, the endless effects work. It drained him until even breathing felt like work. He pushed his body because he didn't know how to stop pushing. Every win only made him chase the next one harder, even when it was hurting him. Right after that, he filmed World Trade Center, and the emotional cost was far worse. He played real NYPD officer John McLaughlin, one of the men who survived being buried when the Twin Towers collapsed during the 9/11 attacks in New York City. Cage wanted to honor the people who actually lived through that day, so he forced himself into their fear. He locked himself in sensory deprivation tanks to feel the darkness and pressure of being trapped under rubble. He read accounts from survivors and rescue workers until their memories followed him into his sleep. Halfway through the shoot, he began having panic attacks. His body shook, his heart raced. At times, he could not tell where the role ended and his own fear began. The irony was brutal. Two of the biggest moments of his career, one a commercial triumph, the other a deeply respected drama, arrived just as he was starting to fall apart inside. The world saw a man at the top of Hollywood. Cage felt like a man drowning, dragged under by the very success he had spent his entire life trying to earn. Things would only get even worse when the IRS entered the picture. Cage was hit with more than $14 million in unpaid taxes. His properties were seized. His accounts were drained. He had no choice but to take every role he could find. Between 2010 and 2015, he appeared in 29 direct-to-video films, working non-stop just to keep his head above water. As Nicolas Cage worked to rebuild his career and pay off debt through the 2000s and early 2010s, his personal life was falling apart in painful public ways. His relationship with actress Christina Fulton began in 1988 and ended in 1991, but their breakup left deep resentment on both sides. Their son, Weston Coppola Cage, was born in 1990, tying them together long after the romance ended. Fulton later accused Cage of controlling behavior during their years together, saying he tried to dictate her movements and relationships. Time did not calm the conflict. In 2025, more than 30 years after their split, Fulton filed a lawsuit against Cage, accusing him of failing to intervene during Weston's long struggle with violent episodes linked to mental illness. The lawsuit forced old wounds back into the spotlight, turning private pain into public scrutiny. Cage's next major relationship began when he met Patricia Arquette in 1987. They married in April 1995, but the marriage cracked almost immediately. After only 9 months, they separated, driven apart by Cage's emotional distance and the constant pressure of his career. While he was filming Con Air in 1996, Arquette was left alone as her mother battled cancer, a moment she later described as devastating.
A horrible thing to lose somebody to cancer, and our mom was only 57. A lot of times women put themselves at the bottom of the list. And
they attempted reconciliation, but it never held. Their marriage officially ended in 2001, leaving Cage with another loss tied to the relentless pace of his work. In 2004, Cage married Alice Kim, a 19-year-old waitress he met in Los Angeles. Cage was 40. Their age gap drew attention, but he believed this marriage would anchor him. It lasted 12 years, his longest relationship. Yet the cracks appeared early. In 2011, Cage was arrested in New Orleans after grabbing her arm during an argument, an incident fueled by stress and alcohol. Rumors of infidelity followed him, and by January 2016, they separated. The divorce became public in June of that same year, ending what he once hoped would be his most stable chapter. Then came Erica Koike. Cage married her in Las Vegas on March 23, 2019. By March 27th, just 4 days later, he filed for annulment. Footage showed him slurring that he didn't want to go through with it, while Koike insisted she never pressured him.
Erica Koike just hours after they got married, and just days before attempting to end their marriage.
He claimed intoxication and hidden truths about her past. The public humiliation was immediate and unforgiving, and behind all of this were the exotic pets, the $150,000 octopus, the 2 albino king cobras, the shark, the crocodile. Cage said they helped his creativity, but to outsiders they looked like signs of a man spiraling. collecting danger the way he once collected roles. With his reputation shattered and his finances gutted, Cage reached the lowest point of his life, forcing one final desperate reinvention. By the late 2010s, Nicolas Cage was exhausted, humiliated, and nearly erased by the industry he had once dominated. But he kept working. He kept paying. Slowly, painfully, he began to climb out of the hole. He sold properties he once thought he would keep forever, including castles, mansions, and the island that had once symbolized success. One by one, the tax liens were cleared. By the 2023, his massive IRS debt was fully settled. The financial nightmare that had swallowed him whole was finally over. Then came the film that changed everything, Pig 2021. It was quiet, small, and nothing like the movies people expected from him. But Cage poured his entire soul into it. He played a lonely truffle hunter grieving the only creature that loved him without conditions. The performance stunned critics.
It's just coyotes.
The film earned 97% on Rotten Tomatoes, won him an Independent Spirit Award, and marked his first major critical recognition since leaving Las Vegas. Audiences saw something in him they had forgotten, a tenderness, a depth, a heartbreak that no action movie could ever reveal. Overnight, Cage was not a meme, a punchline, or a tax story. He was an actor again. By 2025, his net worth had climbed back to $40 million. He lived modestly in Las Vegas and kept a quiet home in Malibu. He no longer bought rare animals or abandoned mansions. He no longer chased vanity. And then, in a recent discussion, he finally broke his silence. He spoke plainly about the years he had tried to hide. "I carried so much shame I could barely look people in the eye," he said. "I thought my failures made me unlovable." His voice shook when he added, "I wasn't running from the world, I was running from myself." For the first time, Cage admitted how deep the damage truly went. "People saw the mansions and the castles," he said, "but they never saw me crying alone on the floor because I didn't know how to stop losing everything." He admitted he had spent nights believing he would never work again. "I thought I had ruined my name forever," he confessed. "I thought my son would grow up thinking I was a joke." He revealed the toll on his mental health. "There were days I couldn't get out of bed. I was terrified someone would call and say I owed more money. I lived in fear of my phone." He also spoke about the emotional collapse behind the roles. "When the IRS came after me, I felt like my life was being peeled away piece by piece. I didn't know who I was without the things I had bought." He admitted the mistakes he had avoided discussing for years. "I hurt people I cared about. I hurt myself. I kept thinking one more movie, one more paycheck, one more distraction would make the pain go away." His voice cracked when he said, "But you can't outrun grief. You can't escape guilt. It follows you." For the first time, Cage admitted the truth behind the chaos. "I spent years trying to fix everything with money, with work, with noise, but what I really needed was forgiveness, especially my own." He ended with a line that stunned everyone listening. "I used to think losing everything was my punishment. Now I understand it was the only way I could find myself." Make sure to click the cards on the screen now for more interesting videos.